The silence in that dusty, cramped living room was thick enough to choke on. My father, Robert Miller, stood over me, his face a mask of purple rage, veins throbbing in his temples. He pointed a shaking finger at the door, the words tearing from his throat like a primal scream. "Leave! And don't you ever come back!" I was 16, terrified, but something snapped inside me that day. It wasn't just the anger. It was the chilling realization that everything I thought I knew about my family, about loyalty, was a lie. That moment wasn't just about being kicked out. It was the instant my world shattered, revealing a betrayal so deep, so insidious, it would haunt me for decades. This wasn't some teenage rebellion gone wrong. This was a calculated act, orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to protect me. And it set me on a path to uncover a truth so shocking it would make headlines. What would you do if your entire life, every memory, every cherished moment, turned out to be a carefully constructed deception? What if the people you loved most were secretly plotting your downfall? For years, I lived with that question, a gnawing resentment festering in my gut. I tried to move on, to build a new life from the ashes of the old, but the past clung to me like a shadow. Every success felt hollow, every moment of peace tainted by the unresolved injustice. I became obsessed with finding out why. Why me? Why then? The answers, when they finally came, were far more twisted than I could have ever imagined, revealing a legacy of greed and manipulation that stretched back generations. Imagine inheriting what you believe is a fortune, only to discover it's a poisoned chalice. Imagine learning that your own flesh and blood conspired to strip you of your birthright, leaving you with nothing but a broken spirit and a burning desire for retribution. My journey wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming my name, my dignity, and the truth. It was about exposing the rot at the core of a family that paraded as pillars of the community, while secretly preying on the innocent. I'm going to tell you a story that spans over 30 years. A story of a young man cast out into the world with nothing but a fierce determination and a secret promise to make them pay. This isn't a tale of petty grievances. It's a saga of intricate planning, unexpected alliances, and the kind of long-game revenge that leaves you breathless. You'll witness the moments of crushing defeat, the glimmers of hope, and the relentless pursuit of a justice that felt impossible to achieve. From sleeping in my beat-up car in a desolate parking lot in rural Ohio, to standing in the hallowed halls of a federal courthouse in New York City, every step was a battle. Every setback fueled my resolve. I learned the hard way that sometimes the only way to heal a deep wound is to expose it, no matter how ugly the truth might be. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It had implications that reached far beyond our family, touching lives I never knew existed, all victims of the same predatory scheme. The turning point came years later, in a dusty attic, sifting through old boxes. I stumbled upon a hidden compartment in a forgotten chest, and inside, a single yellowed envelope. The contents weren't what I expected. They were far worse. This wasn't just about a will. It was about a systematically orchestrated campaign of fraud, a meticulously crafted web of lies designed to disinherit me and enrich those who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle. The documents I found that day were a blueprint of their deceit, a smoking gun that would ignite a firestorm. My hands trembled as I read, the words blurring through a haze of shock and renewed anger. This wasn't just my father's doing. It was a multi-person conspiracy, involving aunts, uncles, and even a family lawyer. The depth of their perfidy was staggering. They had literally stolen my future, piece by agonizing piece. But what they didn't count on was the resilience of a spirit they thought they had crushed. They didn't realize that their cruelty had forged an unyielding will, a single-minded focus on one thing, justice. The path to confrontation was fraught with danger. I faced threats, intimidation, and moments where I genuinely feared for my life. They were powerful, entrenched, and desperate to keep their secrets buried. But I had something they didn't. The truth. And a secret weapon. A single simple phrase whispered to me by a stranger. that I knew, when the time was right, would bring their entire empire crashing down. That moment when I finally stood before them, years after being cast out, wasn't about yelling or accusations. It was about delivering a quiet, devastating truth. The look on their faces, the dawning horror as they realized their carefully constructed lies were unraveling, was more satisfying than any scream. And what I said next, just a few words, left them utterly speechless, exposed, and facing the consequences of their actions. How did I go from a bewildered, abandoned teenager to the architect of their downfall? What was the secret that allowed me to turn their betrayal into my ultimate triumph? This is the story of how a whispered secret, a hidden document, and an unshakable resolve led to the most shocking family reckoning in recent memory. You're about to hear the full, unvarnished truth. A truth that proves sometimes the quietest words carry the loudest impact. You won't believe what happened. The stifling heat of the Texas summer always brought a certain kind of quiet to our small town, a hush that settled over the dusty streets and made every sound echo. For Eleanor, it usually meant long, lazy days, the kind filled with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant hum of cicadas. This year, though, the quiet felt different, heavy with an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks, ever since the letter arrived. It wasn't a letter in the traditional sense, more a thick, official-looking envelope, its contents a stark white paper with bold black lettering that had shattered the fragile peace of our home. The initial shock had been a physical blow, a collective gasp that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My dad, a man whose hands had built half the houses in this county, had crumpled the paper in his fist, his face a mask of disbelief. My mother, usually the picture of stoic resilience, had simply stared, her eyes wide and unseeing. I remember the way the sunlight, usually so comforting, had seemed to bleach the color from everything, leaving us in a monochrome world of fear. The words on that paper had been clear, unambiguous. An eviction notice. Not just any eviction, but one initiated by the very people we had trusted, the people who had been our neighbors for generations, the Westbrooks. The Westbrook family owned most of the land around us, vast stretches of prime Texas real estate that had been in their name since before the oil boom. Our small farm, nestled right on the edge of their sprawling ranch, had always felt like an anomaly, a tiny island in their sea of wealth. For years there had been an unwritten agreement, a handshake deal between my grandfather and Old Man Westbrook, a promise that our family would always have this land. It was a promise that had been honored through 2 generations, a foundation upon which Eleanor's entire life was built. Now that foundation was crumbling. The resentment began to fester almost immediately, a low, burning ember in my gut that threatened to ignite into a full-blown inferno. It wasn't just the threat of losing our home, it was the betrayal. David Westbrook, the current patriarch, had always presented himself as a benevolent figure, a pillar of the community. He'd smiled at church, offered condolences at funerals, and even bought produce from our small stand. We had seen him as a friend, a protector, someone who upheld the old ways. That illusion had shattered into a million pieces the moment that notice arrived. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, frantic phone calls, and the growing realization of our powerlessness. My dad, usually so strong, seemed to shrink before my eyes. He walked with a slump, his shoulders burdened by a weight I couldn't comprehend. My mother, ever practical, began to pack, her movements slow and deliberate, each item she placed in a box feeling like another nail in the coffin of our life here. I watched them, a knot of anger tightening in my chest. How could they just accept this? How could we let the Westbrooks do this to us? I tried to talk to my dad, to convince him there was another way, some legal loophole, some forgotten clause. He just shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if searching for answers in the shimmering heat. "They have the lawyers, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice raspy with defeat. "They have the money. We have nothing." His words were a cold splash of water, extinguishing any flicker of hope I held. But they also ignited something else, a spark of defiance. My resentment wasn't just for the Westbrooks, it was for the injustice of it all, for the way the powerful could simply crush the powerless without a second thought. I started to notice things, small details I'd overlooked before. The way David Westbrook's eyes always seemed to hold a calculating glint, even when he smiled. The casual arrogance in his son Marcus's voice when he spoke to the townspeople. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the true nature of the empire that surrounded us. One sweltering afternoon, as I helped my mother box up my grandmother's old porcelain dolls, I overheard a snippet of conversation between my parents. My dad was on the phone, his voice low and strained. "No, Mr. Henderson, we don't have that kind of money. We just need more time." He paused, listening, then his voice dropped even lower. He said, "What?" He said it's for a new development? The word development hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. It wasn't just about land. It was about profit, about expanding their empire, and we were just a small, inconvenient obstacle in their path. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The cicadas outside seemed to hum a mournful tune, and the familiar creaks of our old farmhouse sounded like groans of despair. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the eviction notice replaying in my mind. The injustice burned, a fiery pit in my stomach. This wasn't just about losing a house. It was about losing our history, our identity, everything my family had worked for. Eleanor felt a shift, a hardening inside her. The fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, unwavering resolve. We wouldn't just leave. Not like this. Not without a fight. The Westbrooks had started something, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I was going to finish it. The Westbrooks had started something, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I was going to finish it. My mind replayed the scene in our living room, the crumpled paper, my parents' faces etched with a fear I had never seen before. That fear, however, had quickly curdled into a cold, hard anger within me, a resolve that solidified with each passing hour. We were not just some anonymous tenants to be discarded. We were the Westbrooks' neighbors, their long-standing silent partners in this small slice of Texas. Our farm had been a buffer, a quiet, unassuming presence that kept their vast ranch from feeling entirely isolated. Now they were tearing that buffer down, and with it, generations of unspoken trust. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls and hushed conversations. My dad, usually so self-assured, seemed to shrink with every rejection from lawyers who claimed the Westbrooks' legal team was impenetrable, their claim airtight. "They own the land, Westbrook," one attorney had said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Your family only had a verbal agreement, a handshake, that won't stand up in court against a signed deed." The words felt like a punch to the gut, echoing the hopelessness that was starting to seep into my parents' eyes. But for me, each setback only fueled the fire. I watched my mother, a woman who had always faced adversity with quiet strength, now moving through our home like a ghost, her shoulders slumped, her spirit visibly dimming. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about protecting the people I loved, about fighting for their dignity. I started digging, not in the fields, but into the Westbrook family's history. Our small town, like many in rural Texas, held its secrets close, but it also had an unwritten archive of gossip, whispers, and long-forgotten tales. I spent hours at the dusty county records office, sifting through old property deeds, tax assessments, anything that might give me an edge. The clerks, familiar faces from church and the general store, eyed me with a mixture of pity and curiosity, but I ignored their glances, my focus absolute. I visited the local library, poring over microfiche of old newspapers, searching for any mention of the Westbrook name that might hint at a weakness, a vulnerability. Most articles were glowing, detailing their philanthropic efforts, their contributions to the community, painting a picture of an untouchable, benevolent dynasty. But I knew better. No family, no matter how powerful, was without its skeletons. One sweltering afternoon, while everyone else was taking shelter from the oppressive heat, I found myself at the home of Old Man Hemlock, a retired surveyor who had lived in this town longer than anyone. His house, a ramshackle collection of mismatched editions, smelled of old paper and stale coffee. He greeted me with a roomy stare, his memory as fragmented as the peeling paint on his porch. "Westbrook, you say?" he mumbled, adjusting his spectacles. "Ah, yes. Fine people, the Westbrooks." "Always have been." I pressed him, asking about the original land deals, about the early days when our families first settled here. He rambled, his stories weaving between coherent facts and nostalgic tangents, but then, a flicker. "There was that business, you know," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "with Spring. Old Man Westbrook. The first one, he was a shrewd one, all right. He spoke of a natural spring, a vital water source that ran through what was now Westbrook land, but whose original boundaries had been disputed for decades. A small, forgotten court case from the early 1900s, dismissed due to lack of evidence, but one that hinted at a deeper, more insidious acquisition of land. It was a long shot, a thread barely visible, but it was a thread nonetheless. I left Man Hemlock's house with a renewed sense of purpose, the Texas sun beating down on me, but feeling a cold resolve hardening my spirit. This wasn't just about an eviction notice anymore. It was about an old injustice, a deep-seated wrong that had festered for generations. The Westbrooks had built their empire on something more than just shrewd business deals, and I was going to unearth it. I didn't know what I would find, or if it would even matter, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when my family's entire future, their very identity, hung in the balance. This fight had become personal, a quiet war waged in the shadows, and I was just beginning to gather my weapons. The library became my sanctuary, my battleground. Instead of dusty tomes, I found myself surrounded by microfiche readers and digital archives, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of hay and honest labor. My days began before dawn, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a burning need for answers. I scoured old county records, property deeds, and obscure legal documents, anything that might shed light on the Westbrook family's history. My goal was simple: find the crack in their fortress, the hidden vulnerability that would expose their true nature. The initial research was painstakingly slow, a monotonous parade of names and dates that blurred into an indistinguishable mess. I felt like a detective in a forgotten film, sifting through endless red herrings. Then, a name started to appear with unsettling frequency. Elias Westbrook, the patriarch's great-grandfather. His name was tied to several land acquisitions in the early 1900s, transactions that seemed unusually swift and devoid of typical legal challenges. It was a faint whisper of a pattern, a thread I instinctively pulled. My breakthrough came not from a grand revelation, but a tiny, almost invisible detail in a century-old property transfer document. Most of the Westbrook land deals were straightforward, but one particular parcel, acquired in 1912, had a peculiar amendment. A clause, almost hidden in plain sight, stated that the land was transferred under duress, for an undisclosed sum, with no further recourse. That phrase hit me like a jolt of electricity. Under duress. It suggested coercion, something illicit. This wasn't just a shrewd business deal, it hinted at a darker history, a pattern of acquisition that stretched back generations. The more I dug into Elias Westbrook's dealings, the clearer the picture became. He wasn't just a successful rancher, he was a ruthless opportunist, known for exploiting local farmers during the droughts and economic downturns of the early 20th century. He would offer loans with predatory interest rates then. When the farmers inevitably defaulted, he'd swoop in and seize their land. It was a legal, yet morally bankrupt strategy. My stomach churned with a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. This was it. This was the rot beneath the polished veneer of the Westbrook dynasty. I found several affidavits from descendants of those original families, buried deep in obscure historical societies. They spoke of intimidation, threats, and families driven from their homes, their livelihoods shattered. These were not just isolated incidents, they were a systemic pattern, a blueprint for how the Westbrook Empire had been built. Our family's situation wasn't an anomaly, it was merely the latest iteration of a century-old playbook. The resentment I felt transformed into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about our farm anymore, it was about exposing a legacy of injustice. The next step was risky. I needed to connect these historical patterns to the current Westbrook generation, to show that their actions were not merely coincidental, but a continuation of their family's predatory practices. I started looking into their current business dealings, their recent land acquisitions. It was a maze of shell corporations and offshore accounts designed to obscure true ownership. But I was learning. I was becoming adept at navigating the murky waters of corporate finance. One evening, while cross-referencing a list of properties acquired by a Westbrook subsidiary, I stumbled upon a name that made my blood run cold: Franklin Thorne. He was a well-known, albeit disgraced, land surveyor who had lost his license years ago for falsifying documents. Thorne had been involved in several of the Westbrook family's more recent, highly contentious land deals, including the very one that put our farm at risk. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying clarity. The Westbrooks weren't just relying on old tactics, they were employing modern-day fraudsters to achieve their aims. The thought of confronting Thorne was daunting. He was a shadowy figure, rumored to be dangerous, but he was also my best lead. He held the key to unlocking the truth behind the eviction notice. I knew this was a dangerous path, a descent into a world far removed from the quiet life I had always known. But my family's future, their very identity, was at stake. I had gathered my weapons, and now it was time to use them. The fight had become personal, a quiet war waged in the shadows, and I was ready to step into the light. My investigation into the Westbrook family's history began with the old county records, dusty ledgers filled with forgotten names and faded land deeds. I spent weeks poring over them, the smell of aged paper and mildew becoming a familiar comfort. The initial eviction notice, stark and unforgiving, had ignited a fire within me, transforming my quiet resentment into a burning obsession. I needed to understand how a handshake deal, honored for generations, could simply vanish. The Westbrooks, particularly Old Man Westbrook, had always projected an image of benevolent landlords, pillars of the community. That image, I was rapidly discovering, was a carefully constructed facade. The breakthrough came not in a legal document, but in a series of old newspaper clippings I found tucked away in the microfiche archives of the town library. They detailed a bitter land dispute from decades ago, involving a small, independent oil wildcatter named Samuel Jenkins and the Westbrook patriarch of that era. Jenkins, a persistent but ultimately outmaneuvered figure, had claimed that the Westbrooks had manipulated property lines, effectively stealing a significant portion of his oil-rich land. The court had sided with the Westbrooks, citing a seemingly ironclad deed, but the articles hinted at whispers, rumors of coercion and backroom deals. The parallels to our own situation were chilling. My focus shifted from the present to the past, from the immediate threat of eviction to the systemic pattern of the Westbrooks' land acquisition. This wasn't just about our farm, it was about a legacy of deceit, built piece by piece, acre by acre. The more I dug, the more I saw how the Westbrook name, synonymous with wealth and power, was also stained with a history of underhanded dealings. They hadn't just inherited their fortune, they had actively, ruthlessly expanded it, often at the expense of smaller landowners like us. The betrayal I felt deepened, transforming into a cold, calculated resolve. I knew I couldn't confront them with just rumors. I needed irrefutable proof, something concrete that would expose their methods. The key, I suspected, lay in Samuel Jenkins's lost claim. If I could find evidence that his land had indeed been stolen, it would not only vindicate him, but also establish a precedent, a pattern of behavior that could be used against the current Westbrook generation. This wasn't just about saving our farm anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about seeking a justice that had been denied to others for too long. My search led me to the abandoned Jenkins homestead, a dilapidated shack on the far edge of what was now Westbrook property. The air hung heavy, with the scent of decay and forgotten lives. The house was a skeleton, picked clean by time and vandals, but I wasn't looking for heirlooms. I was looking for anything Samuel Jenkins might have left behind, any scrap of paper that could shed light on his doomed legal battle. Days blurred into weeks as I meticulously sifted through the debris, my hands caked with dust and grime, my hope wavering with each empty drawer and overturned box. Just as I was about to give up, disheartened and exhausted, I found it. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard in what must have been Jenkins's study was a small, rusted metal box. Inside, amidst yellowed letters and faded photographs, lay a meticulously kept journal. Samuel Jenkins's journal. Its brittle pages were filled with his neat, looping script, detailing his struggle against the Westbrook family. He had documented everything: the initial negotiations, the shifting property lines, the intimidation tactics, and most critically, a hidden clause in an old survey document that proved the Westbrooks had deliberately misrepresented the boundary. My heart pounded as I read his entries, a chilling echo of our own experience. Jenkins had suspected foul play, but lacked the resources and connections to prove it. He wrote of his frustration, his despair, and his ultimate defeat. But he also wrote of his secret, his final act of defiance, a hidden copy of the original, unaltered survey, tucked away somewhere safe, a contingency in case his legal battle failed. He had known, even then, that the Westbrooks were not to be trusted. He had prepared for a future reckoning. The journal didn't reveal the exact location of the hidden survey, only that it was where the old oak meets the new fence, under the roots of the past. I spent days scouring the property, mapping old fence lines against current ones, searching for any sign of a significant oak tree. The Westbrooks had long since replaced the original fences, making the task nearly impossible. The sun beat down relentlessly, mirroring the pressure building within me. This was my last chance, my only hope of truly fighting back. Finally, near a gnarled ancient oak that stood solitary in a field now used for Westbrook cattle, I noticed a subtle depression in the earth, almost imperceptible. Digging carefully, my hands aching, I unearthed a sealed metal cylinder. Inside, protected by layers of wax and canvas, was the original survey document, dated nearly a century ago. It clearly showed the true boundary line, a line that placed a significant portion of what was now Westbrook land squarely within Samuel Jenkins's original claim. It was the smoking gun, the definitive proof of their long-standing deception. Holding that brittle parchment, I felt a surge of XLR triumph. This wasn't just about our farm anymore. This was about exposing a century of lies, about reclaiming a truth that had been buried for too long. The Westbrook family's carefully constructed empire, built on the stolen dreams of others, was about to crumble. I had found my weapon, and I was ready to wield it. The quiet war was over. The battle was about to begin. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, a palpable hum that vibrated through the old wooden benches. Every eye was on me, but my gaze was fixed on the Westbrook family, their faces a mixture of smug confidence and thinly veiled annoyance. They still believed they had this in the bag, that their money and influence would once again smooth over any inconvenient truths. They didn't know I held the key to unlocking generations of their carefully guarded secrets. I took a deep breath, the taste of dust and old paper on my tongue, and began to speak. My voice, surprisingly steady, filled the room. I started not with the eviction notice, but with the land itself, tracing its history back to the original deeds, the ones my grandfather had meticulously preserved. I spoke of the unwritten agreement, the handshake deal, the decades of peace and cooperation between our families. I painted a picture of a time when honor still meant something, when a man's word was his bond, a stark contrast to the betrayal that now hung heavy in the air. The Westbrook family shifted uncomfortably, their smiles faltering as I laid out the foundation of their deception. Then, I introduced the bombshell. I didn't just talk about the forged signatures on the new fraudulent lease they'd tried to force on us. I presented the original documents, the ones they'd believed destroyed, proving the land was legally ours, not just by handshake but by forgotten law. I detailed the dates, the names, the subtle discrepancies that, when illuminated by the truth, became glaring red flags. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a ripple of disbelief spreading through the spectators. The Westbrook lawyer, who had been so dismissive, now looked genuinely rattled, fumbling with his papers. But I wasn't finished. This wasn't just about our farm, it was about every family they had wronged, every small landowner they had systematically squeezed out. I produced a stack of affidavits, carefully collected over months, from other families who had lost their land to the Westbrook Empire through similar underhanded tactics. Each affidavit was a story of a broken promise, a stolen dream, a life uprooted. I read excerpts, my voice unwavering, the raw emotion of those testimonies echoing in the quiet courtroom. The collective gasp from the gallery was almost deafening. The Westbrook patriarch, usually so composed, looked as though he'd been struck. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. The climax arrived when I presented the ultimate piece of evidence, a series of letters, unearthed from an old family Bible, written by Old Man Westbrook himself. These weren't just any letters, they were correspondence between him and my great-grandfather, discussing the very land in question, explicitly acknowledging our family's rightful ownership, and the binding nature of their agreement. These letters, written decades ago, were a direct refutation of every claim the current Westbrook generation had made. They spoke of respect, of shared values, of a promise that transcended generations. The irony was brutal. The very foundation of their family's legacy was now dismantling their current deceit. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel trying to restore order, but the dam had broken. The Westbrook family, once so imposing, now looked like cornered animals. Their carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the rotten core beneath. The patriarch, Westbrook himself, rose from his seat, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and fear. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice hoarse. "You'll regret this. You'll regret every word." I met his gaze, my own eyes cold and steady. "I regret nothing," I said, my voice cutting through the lingering chaos. "The truth has a way of finding its way out, Westbrook. And today, it found you." The words hung in the air, a final, definitive statement. The battle wasn't just won. It was a complete, undeniable rout. The years of quiet resentment, the simmering anger, the relentless obsession with justice, it all culminated in this moment. The silence that followed was not one of anticipation, but of stunned realization. The empire of lies had finally fallen. The stunned silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as the full weight of my words settled over the courtroom. The empire of lies, built brick by painstaking brick over generations, had finally crumbled. Mr. Henderson, the Westbrook family's slick, self-assured lawyer, stood frozen, his mouth agape, the color draining from his face. He had arrived so confident, so utterly convinced of victory, armed with his neatly packaged narrative of a struggling farm and a generous, benevolent Westbrook offering a way out. Now his carefully constructed edifice lay in ruins around him. Across the aisle, Mrs. Westbrook, usually so composed and unreadable, had recoiled as if struck. Her eyes, which had always held a glacial indifference, now flickered with a raw, almost primal fear. Her husband, Mr. Westbrook, the patriarch, the man who had always seemed to embody an unshakable authority, sat slumped, his shoulders caved in, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. The judge, a man known for his unflappable demeanor, cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to crack the heavy silence. He looked from me to the Westbrooks, then back to the evidence, a stack of meticulously compiled documents that laid bare their decades of deception. I felt a strange lightness, a sensation of burdens lifting, one by one. The relentless obsession that had consumed my every waking thought, the simmering anger that had burned a hole in my gut, the quiet resentment that had been a constant companion, all of it began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of calm. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about reclaiming something far more precious than land or money. It was about truth, about dignity, about proving that even the most powerful cannot escape the consequences of their actions forever. The judge's voice, when it finally came, was clear and resonant, cutting through the lingering tension. He spoke of irrefutable evidence, of a clear pattern of predatory practices, of a blatant disregard for a long-standing agreement. He spoke of justice. The word hung in the air, a bell tolling the end of one era and the beginning of another. He ruled in our favor. The Westbrook family's claim to our land was nullified. Not only that, but the judge ordered a significant restitution for damages, a sum that would ensure our farm's future for generations to come. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Many of the faces I saw were familiar, neighbors who had watched our struggle with a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Now their expressions were a blend of shock and quiet triumph. I saw my dad, his face streaked with tears, a raw, open relief washing over him. My mother, usually so reserved, reached for his hand, her grip tight and unwavering. Their faces, once etched with worry and exhaustion, now held a luminescence, a faint glow of hope. Mr. Henderson, finally regaining some semblance of composure, stood to address the judge, his voice hoarse. "Your Honor, we intend to appeal." But the words lacked their usual conviction, sounding hollow and desperate. The judge simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The battle was over, the war decisively won. The Westbrooks, for all their wealth and influence, had been exposed, their carefully cultivated image of respectability shattered. As we walked out of the courthouse, the Texas sun, which had felt so oppressive just hours before, now seemed to shine with a renewed warmth. The air, no longer heavy with unspoken tension, felt crisp and clean. We were met by a small crowd of supporters, their cheers and applause a balm to our weary souls. My dad clapped me on the back, his eyes shining with a pride that transcended words. "You did it, Westbrook," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it. The path forward would not be without its challenges. Rebuilding takes time, healing takes effort. The scars of the past would undoubtedly linger, faint echoes of the long, arduous fight." But standing there, bathed in the glow of that afternoon sun, I knew we had found something more valuable than any sum of money or tract of land. We had found our voice. We had stood up against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. The bitterness, the resentment, the consuming obsession, it had all served a purpose, a painful, necessary journey that had led us to this moment of profound, if bittersweet, closure. The Westbrooks, I knew, would never truly recover from this. Their reputation, their standing in the community, their very legacy, had been irrevocably tarnished. They had lost more than just a lawsuit. They had lost the illusion of their own invincibility. And as for us, we had gained not just our land back, but a renewed sense of purpose, a stronger bond as a family, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice, in its own deliberate way, had finally prevailed. The long night was over. The dawn had truly broken. The air in the courtroom crackled with a tension I could almost taste. Every eye was on me, waiting. Dad, on the witness stand, had just finished his performance, a teary-eyed monologue about my supposed ingratitude and mental instability. He had painted a picture of a devoted father, a man wronged by his own flesh and blood, and for a terrifying moment, I saw the jury nodding along. My stomach churned with a familiar resentment, the same bitterness that had festered in me for years, ever since the day he'd first told me I was nothing. My lawyer, a stoic woman named Ms. Davies, gave me a reassuring glance. "Westbrook," she said, her voice calm but firm, "your turn." I walked to the stand, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. This was about everything. This was about the little boy who'd been told he was worthless. The teenager who'd been gaslit into believing his own memories were lies. The man who'd finally found the courage to fight back. The betrayal I'd felt when I discovered the forged documents, the elaborate scheme to cut me out completely, had fueled an obsession, a relentless drive to expose the truth. "Mr. Miller," the opposing counsel began, his voice dripping with condescension, "your father has presented a compelling case. He claims you have a history of delusions, of making up stories for attention. Can you explain why we should believe anything you say?" I looked at him, then at Dad, who was watching me with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. The anger rose, hot and swift, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the chaotic, destructive rage of my youth. This was a cold, calculated fury. "My father," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "has always been a master storyteller. He crafted narratives that suited him, regardless of the truth. He told me I was a failure, that I'd never amount to anything. He told my mother that her dreams were foolish. He told everyone around him exactly what they wanted to hear, all while manipulating them for his own gain." I paused, letting my words hang in the air. "He claims I'm delusional. But the truth is, he's the one living in a delusion of control, of infallibility. For years, I believed his lies. I believed I was the problem. I believed I was broken." My gaze found Dad's. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. Then I started to remember, not just vague feelings, but specific instances, the way he'd subtly undermine my achievements, the way he'd twist my words, the way he'd isolate me from anyone who genuinely cared. I pulled a small, worn photograph from my pocket. It was a picture of me as a child, perhaps 7 or 8, standing beside my mother. She was smiling, holding a small, intricately carved wooden bird. "This was a gift from my mother," I explained, my voice softening. "She carved it herself. She was an artist, a dreamer. My father told her she was wasting her time, that her art was worthless. He convinced her to stop, to give up on the one thing that truly made her happy." I looked at Dad. He was staring at the photo, his face pale. "He also told me," I continued, my voice rising slightly, "that he had to sell all of her artwork after she died because it was unsellable clutter. But I found this bird, hidden away in a box of old papers, long after he claimed everything was gone. I held it up for the jury to see. This isn't just a bird. It's a symbol of her silenced voice, of his betrayal, and of the truth he tried to bury." The courtroom was silent. You could hear a pin drop. He forged documents to disinherit me. He manipulated my mother's will. He tried to erase me, just as he tried to erase her. But the truth, like this bird, always finds its way out. Dad yelled, "Leave! You're a liar!" His face was contorted with rage, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. The judge slammed his gavel, but before anyone could react, I spoke, my voice cutting through the sudden chaos, clear and strong. "The only thing I'm leaving, Dad, is your shadow. And the only thing I'm taking with me is the truth." The words hung in the air, a declaration, a reckoning. The jury, who had been swayed by his tears, now saw the raw, unmasked fury of a man exposed. The verdict, when it came, was a vindication. The inheritance was mine. But more than that, the truth was out. The cost had been immense. Years of emotional turmoil, a fractured family, and a public battle. Yet, as I walked out of that courtroom, the afternoon sun warm on my face, a profound sense of bittersweet closure washed over me. The resentment was still a faint echo, but it was overshadowed by a quiet peace. I had faced my tormentor, not with his weapons of deception, but with the unwavering light of truth. And in doing so, I had finally found my voice.